Hello everyone. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. When I opened my door that morning, the note was taped to it, looking out of place among the usual mail and advertisements. The handwriting was messy, almost hurried, and the words stood out like a warning. We need to talk about last night. I froze for a moment, trying to piece together any memory of the previous evening, but nothing came to mind. I hadn't seen my neighbor, hadn't even thought about them, and certainly hadn't done anything that would warrant such an odd message. I stared at the note, feeling a strange sense of unease. I tried to brush it off as some kind of mistake, maybe it was meant for someone else. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed impossible that it was anything but directed at me. My mind raced as I tried to think back to the night before. I had stayed in, watched TV, and then gone to bed early. No late-night visitors, no strange noises, nothing unusual at all. So why would my neighbor say we needed to talk? After a few minutes of staring at the note, I felt compelled to go over and speak with them. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, or perhaps they had mistakenly thought I was involved in something. I hadn't had any interaction with them before, other than the usual polite nods when we crossed paths in the hallway, so I was unsure how to approach them. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to knock on their door. I knocked 3 times, each tap of my knuckles seeming louder than the last. The silence on the other side made me uneasy, but I waited, hoping to hear movement. A few moments later I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. I checked the time early in the afternoon and figured they had to be home. Their car was parked outside, so they weren't gone for the day. I wasn't sure what to do next. Should I leave the note at their door? Should I try again later? I stood there for a while, my mind spinning with questions. What could they possibly want to talk about? Why didn't they just call or knock on my door instead of leaving such a cryptic message? And why did it feel like something wasn't right? I glanced up and down the hallway, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had taken hold of me. Everything looked the same as always, but there was something off about the silence, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I decided to return to my apartment, hoping that when I checked again, my neighbor would have answered. I spent the rest of the day going about my routine, trying not to let the note dominate my thoughts. But it was no use. I couldn't stop wondering what they meant. The more I thought about it, the more I began to question everything. Had I missed something? Had I done something in my sleep that I couldn't remember? Later that evening, I was making dinner when I heard a knock at my door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was soft, tentative, but unmistakably there. I hurried to answer, half expecting it to be my neighbor, finally coming to explain. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I glanced down the hallway but saw nothing. Just the usual quiet, empty space. My heart raced as I stepped outside to check, but there was no one in sight. Puzzled, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the knock? I checked the locks on the door and double-checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. The silence in the apartment felt heavy now, suffocating, as though something was lurking just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I received another note. This one was taped to my door as well, but this time, the handwriting was different, more frantic, as though someone was in a hurry. It read, "You shouldn't have ignored me. It's too late now." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. What did they mean? I hadn't ignored anyone, hadn't even spoken to anyone in days. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I stood there, staring at the note. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I confront my neighbor if they were still home? I didn't know if I could trust my own judgment at this point. Everything felt strange, surreal, and I was beginning to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I stood there for a while, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. I decided to call the building manager. They didn't answer, but I left a message asking about my neighbor and whether they had been around. I had to wait for a response, but in the meantime I couldn't stop thinking about the notes. The words "it's too late now" echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. That night I went to bed early, hoping for some rest and to put everything behind me. But as the hours passed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of my apartment. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sound of something tapping on my door. I held my breath, listening intently. Was it my mind playing tricks again, or was someone really out there? I waited for what felt like hours, but the sound never came again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning I woke up to a strange sensation, like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like eyes were on me, observing my every move. The silence of the apartment felt suffocating, and the notes seemed to linger in the air, haunting me with their cryptic messages. Later that day, I decided to check the building manager's office again. They were there, and this time they gave me some unsettling news. Apparently my neighbor hadn't paid their rent for the last 2 months, and their lease was about to expire. No one had heard from them, and their apartment had been locked from the inside. The manager had tried to reach them several times, but there had been no response. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the manager spoke. Had the notes been a desperate plea or help? Or had my neighbor known something I didn't? I wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Something was very wrong, and I was somehow caught in the middle of it. I haven't seen my neighbor since that day. Their apartment remains empty, and the hallway feels quieter than ever. The notes stopped coming, but the unease never left. Every time I hear a knock on my door, my heart races, and I can't help but wonder if it's them, or something else entirely. Story 2. I woke up groggy, the pale light of the morning creeping through the curtains. I stretched, the remnants of a restless night still clinging to me. Reaching for my phone on the nightstand, I squinted at the screen, trying to shake off the sleepiness. My fingers brushed against the smooth surface as I unlocked it, expecting the usual flood of notifications. But something was off. My eyes scanned the screen in confusion. There were no messages, no missed calls, not even a single alert. I opened my contacts, thinking I must have somehow missed a call from someone important. But as I scrolled through, my breath caught in my throat. Every single name in my contacts had vanished. My entire list, the people I spoke to regularly, family, friends, co-workers, all of them were gone. Not a single number remained. Panic gripped me as I frantically swiped through the screen, hoping for some kind of error. Maybe it was a glitch, I thought. But as I stared at the empty list, my eyes landed on one name that made my heart skip a beat. At the very bottom, there was a contact I didn't recognize. The name was simple, no notes, no extra information, just a first and last name I couldn't place. I tapped on the contact in a daze. The phone number was unfamiliar too, a string of digits I had never seen before. My mind raced, trying to figure out who it could be. Maybe it was someone I had forgotten about, some forgotten acquaintance. But there was something unsettling about the way it appeared in my list. It felt out of place. I stood up from the bed, my legs a little shaky. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether I should call the number. Something told me not to, that it wasn't safe, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I hesitated for a moment before tapping the call button, holding the phone to my ear. The ringing seemed to stretch on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, finally, someone answered. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. It was a low, monotone voice, almost robotic in its delivery. "Why did you call me?" the voice asked, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The tone was flat, devoid of any emotion or warmth. I didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight, my thoughts scattered. I don't know who you are," I stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. But the voice didn't respond immediately. It was as though the person on the other end was waiting for something, perhaps a response that wasn't coming. Then, finally, they spoke again, their words cold and detached. "You shouldn't have called me," the voice said. And before I could respond, the line went dead. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the phone, still holding it to my ear. My mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Who was that? Why did they have my contact information? And why had I been so stupid as to call them? I quickly checked my call history, but there was no record of the number. It was as if the call had never happened at all. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself it was just a prank or some kind of strange coincidence. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I needed to get some answers. I checked my phone settings, looking for anything that might explain why my contacts had disappeared. But everything seemed normal, aside from the missing list of names. It was like they had been erased, wiped away as if they had never existed. Even my cloud backup showed nothing. There was no way to restore the lost contacts. As the hours passed, unease settled in my gut. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange phone call, the voice that had spoken to me. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt deliberate. Like someone was watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Later that evening, as I sat in my living room, the phone vibrated on the coffee table. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for it, half expecting another strange message or call. But when I checked, I found a text message from the same unknown contact. "I'm still here," it read, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I tried to respond, to ask who they were, but my fingers trembled too much to type. Every time I went to hit send, I found myself hesitating. What if this was something bigger than I could handle? What if this person had access to more than just my contacts? I deleted the message, hoping it would go away, but the anxiety gnawed at me. What did they want? How did they have my number? Why had my contacts been erased, leaving only them behind? The questions swirled in my mind, leaving me on edge. The next few days were a blur of tension. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach dropped. I didn't know if it would be another message from the unknown contact or something else entirely. But the strange feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being monitored, that someone was lurking just beyond my reach. I even started checking the locks on my doors, making sure they were secure before bed. I felt like I couldn't trust anything anymore. My phone, once a harmless tool, now felt like an invasive presence, something that held secrets I couldn't uncover. Then, one evening, as I was scrolling through my contacts once more, something strange happened. The contact appeared again, but this time it was different. The name was still there, but now it had a message attached to it. "I'm closer than you think." A sense of dread washed over me. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. The message didn't make sense. It was impossible. How could they know that? How could they be near me? I quickly turned off my phone, a wave of panic rushing through me. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring this. Something was happening, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. All I knew was that I needed to get away from the phone, from whatever it was that had erased my contacts and left behind this mystery. But the fear that had been growing inside me only deepened. I couldn't run from it. It had already found its way inside, and somehow I knew it wasn't going to let me go. Story 3. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I first saw it. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over the neighborhood. I had just returned home from work and was standing by the door, fumbling for my keys, when I noticed something odd sticking out of the mailbox. It wasn't a letter or a package, at least not anything I recognized. Instead, it was a plain envelope, unmarked, with no name or return address. My curiosity piqued. I pulled it out, half expecting it to be another of those pointless flyers or advertisements that seemed to accumulate in my mailbox. But as soon as I unfolded the envelope, I felt something shift, as though the air had grown heavier. Inside was a map of my neighborhood, or what I thought was my neighborhood. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The streets were the ones I recognized, the parks, the shops, even the grocery store I passed every day. But there was something different about this map. The lines, though precise, weren't printed. They looked hand-drawn, the ink darker in some places, lighter in others. The route was marked in bold red, leading from my street to a location I didn't recognize. I stared at the map for a long time, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced with questions. Who had left this for me? And why? I looked around the neighborhood, half expecting to see someone watching me from behind a tree or through a window, but there was nothing. No one in sight. I tucked the map back into the envelope and went inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I placed the envelope on the table and sat down, my mind still whirling. The more I looked at the map, the stranger it seemed. The marked route didn't take me to a place I knew. It veered off toward the outskirts of town, where the roads grew less familiar. There were no landmarks, no obvious reason to go there. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like an invitation. But an invitation to what? I debated with myself for a long time. Should I ignore it, toss the map in the trash, and forget it ever happened? Or should I follow the route, see where it led? My instincts screamed at me to ignore it. It was ridiculous, I thought. Who in their right mind would leave a map with a route like that marked so carefully? But there was something about it, something about the way it had been left so deliberately that made it impossible for me to just forget. That evening after dinner, I couldn't shake the thought. I found myself walking back to the table, the map still lying there. It beckoned me in a way I couldn't explain. With a sigh, I picked it up and examined it again. This time, I traced the route with my finger, following it from my house down the familiar street, then into the unknown territory beyond. I had to know what lay at the end of the path. I grabbed my jacket and left the house, slipping the map into my pocket. The night had fallen by the time I reached the beginning of the marked route. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that made everything feel just a little bit more ominous. I walked slowly, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood dogs barking, cars passing by seemed distant as I moved farther from the main road. As I reached the point where the map veered off into unfamiliar territory, the roads started to look different. The houses were spaced farther apart, their lawns overgrown. The streetlights were fewer and farther between, and the air had a strange, musty smell, like wet earth and decay. I stopped for a moment, looking around. This part of town didn't feel right. It felt abandoned, as though time had forgotten this place. The route on the map led me down a narrow alley, one that seemed to disappear into the darkness. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder, but there was no turning back now. I had to know what was at the end of this path. The alley was quiet, too quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls of the buildings on either side. The feeling of being watched began to creep up my spine, a chill running through me as I continued walking. At the end of the alley, the road opened up into a small, deserted lot. The buildings around it were old, abandoned, their windows shattered and boarded up. The lot itself was empty, except for a small object placed in the center, just visible in the dim light. My heart began to race. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I couldn't stop now. I stepped into the lot, my breath coming in short gasps, and moved toward the object in the center. It was a small wooden box, weathered and worn, sitting innocently on the ground. There was no sign, no clue as to who had placed it there, or why. The map hadn't indicated anything about a box, but I knew it was what I had come for. The closer I got, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knelt down, examining the box carefully. There was no lock, no handle, just a plain, square shape. I reached out and touched it. The surface was rough, the wood cold beneath my fingers. As soon as I made contact, the hairs on my arms stood on end, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I didn't want to open it, but I had come this far. I needed to know what was inside. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of photographs. They were old, yellowed with age, the edges frayed as though they had been handled over and over. I picked them up one by one, my stomach sinking as I realized the photos were of me. Each one was taken at a different time, some recent, some from months ago. There was one of me walking to work, another of me sitting in my backyard. There were even photos of me at the grocery store, taken from a distance. Whoever had been following me had been watching me for longer than I had realized. At the bottom of the box was a small note, folded neatly. My hand shook as I opened it, the handwriting cramped and uneven. It read, "You were never meant to find this." I couldn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest, my mind whirling. I had to get out of there, away from whatever this was. I slammed the box shut and ran, not looking back until I was safely back in my car, doors locked, windows up. I started the engine and drove home in a daze, my mind unable to process what had just happened. When I got back to my house, I locked every door and window, double-checked everything. The map was still in my pocket, but I didn't want to look at it again. I didn't want to think about the photographs or the note. I didn't want to think about how someone had been watching me. That night, I barely slept, the images from the box flashing through my mind. The map, the photographs, the note, they had all been a warning. But from whom? And why? I had no answers, only questions, and the unsettling feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Story 4. I woke up, feeling disoriented, and reached for my phone, hoping to check the time and see if I had gotten enough sleep. As the screen lit up, I saw a notification from my fitness tracker. It read, "Great run. 3.2 miles completed at 2:13 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't remember going for a run the night before. I hadn't left the house, not even for a walk, and certainly not at 2 a.m. The last thing I remembered was falling asleep on the couch after watching a movie. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the haze, and opened the app to see the details. The run wasn't just an error. It was documented with precise details, distance, pace, and even the route. The app showed my pace was faster than what I had ever managed, and I had completed the run in an impressive time for my usual speed. The map even pointed the exact route I would take when I did go for a jog around the neighborhood. I knew this path well. It was my usual route when I tried to get in some exercise. But I hadn't taken it last night, of that I was sure. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Was it a glitch? Could the app have somehow tracked a run I didn't actually take? I checked the details again, zooming in on the map. The route was accurate, the time exactly what the tracker said, but I had stayed home. I had watched TV until I fell asleep, and I hadn't gone anywhere. The more I thought about it, the less logical it seemed. I hadn't been awake at 2 a.m., so how could I have run that distance without even remembering it? My heart raced. Was I sleepwalking? Could I have gotten up in my sleep and gone for a run? I had heard of people sleepwalking before, but never something this active. A run with detailed tracking seemed impossible. But what if it was true? I stood up, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I had to check my shoes. The idea of me running without remembering it was unsettling, so I walked to the entryway and looked at my running shoes, which I always left neatly by the door. They were still there, undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I needed to understand what had happened, so I decided to check my security cameras. I had cameras outside the house, set up for peace of mind. Maybe they would give me some clue, some piece of evidence that would explain this strange run. I logged into the camera app on my phone, scrolling through the night's footage. The timestamp matched the run's time. At exactly 2:13 a.m. I saw someone move across the frame. A figure in jogging clothes running down the street. It was hard to make out their features, but I could tell it was a person, moving with a pace that seemed too fast for someone just out for a leisurely jog. The figure continued down the street, out of the camera's view, and I watched in stunned silence. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The person on the video wasn't a stranger. They looked like me. It wasn't just the clothes, the same running jacket and sneakers I wore. It was the way the figure moved, the rhythm of their stride. It looked like my own running form. But I hadn't been awake at that time. I hadn't left the house. I went back to the tracker, checking the details again. The map, the distance, the time, all the data was accurate. But how could that be possible? My mind raced through all the explanations, but none seemed to fit. Could someone have hacked my tracker, somehow using it to make it seem like I had run? But who would do that, and why? And how could they possibly know my exact running route? The whole thing felt like a nightmare. I felt a chill run through me as I recalled the times I had heard strange noises in the night, sounds that didn't make sense. Could I have been unknowingly awake during those moments, moving around the house or even outside? The idea of someone impersonating me, running around my neighborhood in the middle of the night, filled me with dread. But the most disturbing thought was that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been waking up with feelings of unease, like I had been somewhere, doing something, but couldn't remember it. I spent the rest of the morning in a fog, trying to make sense of the strange run. I checked the tracker again, but there were no more unexpected activities. The next few nights passed uneventfully, but then a week later it happened again. My fitness tracker recorded another run, this time at 3:08 a.m. My heart stopped when I saw the notification. I checked the footage from my cameras once again, but this time the figure was gone. No trace of anyone running outside, no indication that anyone had even been near my house. The unease lingered, and I felt like I was being watched, as if someone or something was waiting for me to figure out the mystery. But no matter how much I searched for answers, I couldn't find them. My running shoes remained where I left them, and my house stayed locked at night. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that someone was running in my place, or worse, that I was running without knowing it. And the more I tried to understand, the more I realized that I might never know the truth behind the runs that appeared on my fitness tracker in the dead of night. Story 5. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I returned home after a long day at work. I had groceries in one hand and a heavy bag of books in the other, my mind racing with the endless list of things I had to do. As I approached my front door, I reached into my pocket for my keys, but my fingers brushed against the empty fabric. For a split second, I stood frozen, my heart beginning to race. Where was my key? I always kept it in my pocket, or sometimes in my bag, but it was nowhere to be found. A rush of anxiety washed over me, and I turned toward the door. My eyes quickly scanned the ground, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, just barely visible beneath the edge of the doormat, was a glint of metal. My spare house key. The one I kept locked away inside in a small box on the top shelf of my closet. The very same key that had never left my house, tucked away for emergencies. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The doormat had been in place when I left that morning, and I knew with certainty that I hadn't touched it since. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I pulled the key out from its hiding place. The metal was cool and familiar, but the feeling of dread in my stomach only grew stronger. I turned it over, my breath catching in my throat. This was my spare key. There was no mistaking it. But how had it gotten there? My first thought was that I had been absent-minded. Maybe I had dropped it earlier in the day and forgotten. But no, I couldn't remember a single moment when I had even touched the key. It was supposed to be locked away in my house, safe and secure, yet here it was, lying on the doormat. The thought of someone being in my home without my knowledge was enough to send a wave of panic through me. Had I been robbed? Had someone gained access to my house, rifled through my things, and then placed the key back as if nothing had happened? My mind raced with all the possibilities, none of them comforting. I quickly unlocked the door, heart pounding in my chest, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. The faint scent of my morning coffee still lingered in the air, but everything seemed untouched. My furniture was where I had left it, my books neatly stacked on the coffee table. I exhaled a small breath of relief, but the unease lingered in my gut. I made my way to the small wooden box where I always kept my spare key. When I opened it, my heart sank. The box was open, and the key was gone. The lock was still intact, but there was no sign of the key I had left inside just this morning. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I quickly checked every other room in the house, every closet, every drawer. Nothing was out of place. It was as if the person, if someone had indeed been here, had taken only the key and nothing else. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that maybe I had simply misplaced the key. Perhaps I had forgotten to lock the box earlier in the day, or maybe I had carelessly left it unlocked when I retrieved something from it. But none of that felt right. I had been so careful, so sure of where I had placed everything. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house seemed amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the wind tapping against the windows. I kept thinking about the key, about the possibility that someone had been in my house without my knowledge. The thought gnawed at me, and I kept imagining the worst-case scenarios. Had someone been watching me? Had they been waiting for the perfect moment to take what they wanted? The next morning, I called a locksmith. The thought of someone else having access to my home, of knowing where I kept things, where I lived, was enough to make me feel violated. I had the locks changed, and decided to have an extra layer of security installed, just to be safe. But even as I did so, a part of me felt like I was overreacting. After all, maybe it had just been a mistake. Maybe I had simply left the key out of place without realizing it. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. A week passed without incident, and I tried to move on, telling myself that I was being paranoid. Life went on as usual: work, errands, dinner with friends. But the nagging unease never really left. I kept glancing at my door, at the spot where I had found the key, and wondering if someone else had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Then, one evening, as I sat at my desk working on a project, I heard a soft rustling outside my window. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked up, straining to hear any other sound. Nothing, just the quiet of the evening. I shrugged it off, blaming the wind, but that feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't help but wonder if someone had been waiting for me to let my guard down. The following weekend, I was on my way out when I noticed something strange. The door to my house, though I had locked it securely the night before, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped as I stepped closer, fear creeping up my spine. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call someone, but then I pushed the door open. The inside was still the same. Everything appeared untouched. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. But the door, how had it been left open? I felt a chill run down my back as I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. A sense of dread settled over me as I looked around, searching for anything that felt out of place. There was nothing, yet the feeling of someone else being there lingered. As I locked the door behind me once more, I couldn't help but wonder, was it just a coincidence? Or was someone else out there, waiting, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move again? The key was gone, the door had been opened, and the fear that had once seemed so distant was now closing in on me, and I couldn't shake the thought that this was just the beginning. Story 6. I was sitting at my desk, working late into the night, the soft hum of the city outside my window barely noticeable over the click of my keyboard. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional distant car or the gentle rustle of the wind against the trees. It had been an ordinary evening, or so I thought. I was focused on the task at hand when suddenly I heard a loud knock at my window. It was so sharp and abrupt that it sent a shock through my body, my heart racing instantly. I froze, unsure of what to make of it. The knock came again, even louder this time, echoing through the room. I glanced up toward the window, my mind trying to process what had just happened. It was late, well past midnight, and I lived on the 3rd floor of a building. Who could be knocking on my window? It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone outside when I glanced earlier. I turned back to the screen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, a random noise from the building settling. But no, the knock had been too distinct, too purposeful. My heart raced as I stood up and approached the window, my eyes scanning the outside world. The street below was empty, the only light coming from the faint glow of street lamps. No one was there. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see if there was any sign of movement, but the street was deserted. No figures lurking in the shadows, no one walking by. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. My eyes moved from one corner of the street to the other, searching for any clue as to where the knock had come from. But there was nothing, just empty streets and silent buildings. I backed away from the window, feeling an unease creeping up my spine. The knock had been too real, too clear to ignore. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Could it have been a prank? But who would go to the trouble of knocking on a 3rd floor window in the middle of the night? And why? I hadn't heard anything outside my window before. No footsteps, no car doors slamming, no sounds of movement. Just that one jarring knock. It didn't make sense. I sat back down at my desk, trying to focus on my work again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced at the window, I half expected to see someone standing there, staring in at me. The knock had been too forceful, too deliberate. It was almost as if someone wanted my attention. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment grew stronger with each passing minute. I decided to call my friend, hoping that talking to someone would calm my nerves. I dialed her number, waiting for the ring. The phone felt too heavy in my hand, as though it had become a lifeline in that moment. When she picked up, I explained the situation, trying to sound casual. "It was probably nothing," I said, "just some noise from the building, or maybe a bird hitting the window." She reassured me, telling me that it was probably a trick of the mind, that I had been working too late and was overtired. But as we spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She was just as confused as I was. I ended the call and went back to my desk, but the silence in the apartment was suffocating. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind replaying the sound of that knock over and over again. What if it wasn't a coincidence? What if it was someone trying to get my attention, trying to warn me of something? My pulse quickened as I stood up again, pacing the room. I needed to check outside, to make sure there was no one lurking around. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it out the window, scanning the street below. But again, there was nothing. Just as I was about to turn away, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but I saw it. A dark figure moving in and out of view, hidden in the narrow alley next to the building. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but there was definitely something or someone there. I immediately backed away from the window, my heart racing. I had no idea who it was or what they were doing, but I didn't want to find out. I rushed to lock the window, my hands shaking as I secured the latch. The thought of someone standing just outside, watching me, made my skin crawl. But even with the window locked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved to the front door and checked the locks, making sure everything was secure. I didn't know why, but I had a growing sense of dread, as if I were being drawn into something I couldn't control. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't on the window. It came from the door. My heart stopped. I stood frozen for a moment, the blood draining from my face. The knock was so deliberate, so insistent, that it seemed impossible. It wasn't the sound of someone casually tapping. It was the sound of someone who was waiting for me to answer, someone who had been standing outside for far too long. I had no idea how they had gotten there so quickly, but the feeling of being trapped in my own apartment was overwhelming. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I slowly approached the door, my steps cautious, my mind racing. I peeked through the peephole, but there was nothing, no one on the other side. I stood there for a moment, my pulse pounding in my ears. What was going on? Who could it be? I thought about calling the police, but the thought of opening the door, even just to speak to them, terrified me. What if it was someone trying to break in? What if it was something worse? I backed away from the door, my eyes darting to the windows, the phone in my hand ready to dial 911 if I needed to. But the longer I stood there, the more it seemed like I was losing my grip on reality. Was I imagining all of this? Had the stress of the day gotten to me? Or was there really someone out there? Someone who had been knocking, watching, waiting? Eventually the knocks stopped. The silence that followed felt deafening, and I couldn't bring myself to open the door, even after an hour had passed. I stayed in my apartment, every shadow, every sound setting me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person or whatever it was still out there, waiting. Story 7. I sat at my desk, frustrated, trying to complete a simple online purchase. I had just entered my debit card details and clicked pay, but instead of the usual confirmation screen, an error popped up. My debit card had been declined. I stared at the screen for a few moments, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I double-checked the number, expiration date, and swearing everything was correct, but the error came up again. Confused, I grabbed my phone and opened my banking app, hoping to get some answers. When the app loaded, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My account balance was lower than expected. I had just checked it the day before, and there shouldn't have been any new transactions. Yet, as I scrolled through my recent activity, one purchase caught my eye. It wasn't something I recognized, nor was it for an amount I would have spent. The transaction was for a place in a city I'd never visited. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I had been at home all day, working at my desk, not even thinking about traveling anywhere. I immediately called the bank, hoping to get some answers. The representative answered quickly, and I explained the situation. I told her I had just tried to make a purchase, but my card was declined. She asked for my account details and ran a quick check. After a few minutes of silence, she confirmed the charge for the unknown location. She said it was made just hours earlier and that the transaction had gone through successfully. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could this be? I hadn't even left the house. "Can you tell me where the transaction was made?" I asked, my voice shaking. The representative confirmed it was for a store in a city across the country, a place I had never been, a place I had no connection to. My confusion deepened, and I felt a wave of panic begin to rise. "I haven't been anywhere near there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no way my card was used there." She asked me to hold for a moment while she checked further. As I waited, I tried to process everything. How could someone have gotten access to my card details? I hadn't shared my card with anyone. My card was in my possession, locked away in my wallet, and I had only used it a few days ago for groceries. There was no reason anyone else could have used it. The more I thought about it, the more my mind began to race. The representative returned and explained that they would temporarily freeze my card while they conducted an investigation. She also reassured me that they would reverse the fraudulent transaction. But I still felt uneasy. How had this happened? How had someone been able to use my card without my knowledge? I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a while, staring at the screen of my phone. It didn't make sense. I couldn't figure out how someone had stolen my card information. I wasn't a victim of identity theft, at least not that I knew of. I hadn't noticed any suspicious activity on my other accounts. But this felt like something else. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the transaction details in my mind, the amount, the location, and the time. It was as if someone had been watching me, had been following my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. But why? And by whom? The next day, I decided to take extra precautions. I changed the passwords to all of my accounts, set up stronger security measures, and added alerts to monitor any future transactions. I also ordered a new debit card just to be safe. But as I went through the motions, the nagging sense of unease only grew. I couldn't help but feel like I was missing something important, like there was something I wasn't seeing. Then, a few days later, I received a strange email from my bank. It was a confirmation for a new login from an unfamiliar device. The email didn't provide much detail, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Whoever had stolen my card information had also accessed my account. They had my password. How had they gotten it? I had never shared my login credentials with anyone. I immediately logged into my bank account and checked the recent activity. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but the thought that someone else had gained access to my account made my skin crawl. I changed my password again, setting up a two-factor authentication for extra security, but the feeling that something wasn't right still lingered. That evening, I received another call from the bank. They told me they had traced the location of the fraudulent purchase, but it was still unclear how my card had been used. They confirmed that the charge had been made at a physical location, not online. I felt the blood drain from my face. How could someone have used my card in person if I hadn't been there? I felt like I was caught in some kind of nightmare. Every time I thought I had the situation under control, something new would happen to unsettle me. The bank suggested I file a police report, but what was I supposed to say? How could I explain something so bizarre, something I couldn't even understand myself? I filed the report anyway, hoping they would be able to uncover something I had missed. A few days passed, and I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't get the incident out of my mind. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, expecting another notification about suspicious activity. But then something happened that made everything even worse. I received an alert from my bank. It wasn't a regular notification, but an urgent one that stood out from the others. My card had been used again, and this time it was for a much larger purchase. The charge came from the same city I had never visited, at a different store. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Whoever was behind this was getting bolder, and now it felt like they were getting closer to me. I spent the rest of the night on the phone with my bank and the police, trying to figure out what had happened. I didn't know what to believe anymore. It felt as though my identity, my life, was being picked apart piece by piece, but no one could give me a clear answer. They couldn't tell me how my card had been used or who was behind it. They could only tell me that the investigation was ongoing. As the days passed, I kept waiting for some kind of resolution, but it never came. The fraudulent transactions stopped, but the fear didn't. I continued to monitor my accounts, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Whoever had used my card knew something about me, something I didn't know. And as I sat in my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching. Story 8. I was walking down the street, just another ordinary evening, when I passed a row of store windows. The sun had just set, and the street was beginning to quiet down, the glow from the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The window in front of me was clear, with just a few items behind it, probably some clothes or decorations. I glanced at my reflection briefly, as I always do when I walk past a window, checking my appearance and adjusting my coat. But then something caught my eye that made my heart stop. My reflection moved. It wasn't just a subtle movement, it was clear, deliberate. The reflection in the window waved at me. I hadn't raised my hand. I hadn't moved an inch. It was as if my reflection was not mimicking me, but was acting on its own, independent of my actions. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked a few times, trying to understand what I was seeing, but the reflection continued to wave slowly, its hand moving in the same steady, calm motion as if it were waiting for me to respond. I quickly looked around, hoping to catch someone, anyone, near me who might be playing a prank, but the street was empty. I was alone. The reflection in the window didn't seem to notice that I was frozen, staring at it. It simply continued, its hand up, waving slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. It wasn't like it was trying to get my attention, it just moved in that strange way, like it had a mind of its own. The realization hit me all at once. My reflection wasn't mirroring my movements, it was doing something I wasn't doing. My pulse began to quicken. I stepped closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I tried to make sense of it. I moved my hand slightly, cautiously, to see if the reflection would mirror me. It didn't. The wave didn't stop. The figure in the glass simply waited, still smiling faintly, its eyes locked on me. I felt my stomach drop. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I took a step back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was seeing things. Perhaps the reflection was a trick of the light, or maybe I had been so focused on my own movements that I hadn't realized how much I was moving in sync with the reflection. But no, this was different. I had been standing perfectly still. I turned around, my gaze scanning the empty street around me, trying to figure out if anyone had seen what I was seeing. But there was no one. The streetlights flickered slightly. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I turned back to the window, but the reflection was now perfectly still again, just like it should have been. It wasn't waving. It wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there, looking back at me. I took a deep breath and continued walking, forcing my legs to move, though they felt heavy, like I was dragging them through thick mud. My mind wouldn't let go of what I had just seen. The memory of the reflection waving at me replayed in my mind over and over again. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned whether I had imagined the whole thing. But the image was so vivid, so clear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong with that reflection. It wasn't normal. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. I tried to distract myself, telling myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the light, that I was just tired. But as I went about my night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I passed a window or a reflective surface, I would hesitate, almost afraid to glance at it. What if it happened again? What if I saw that reflection waving at me again, even though I wasn't moving? That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about the wave, about how it wasn't just a coincidence. It had to be something more, something strange. My mind raced with thoughts. Was I losing my mind? Was there something wrong with me? Had I seen something that wasn't there? The next morning, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I went about my day working, running errands, trying to do everything as normally as possible. But as I passed a storefront window on my way to the coffee shop, I felt my stomach drop again. I couldn't stop myself from looking at my reflection. This time there was no wave. My reflection was just me standing there. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was stronger than ever. I quickly looked away, hurrying into the coffee shop, my hands slightly trembling as I reached for my order. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just nerves. Maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe my brain had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, I began to feel as though I was being followed. I'd catch glimpses of myself in windows or mirrors, always a little too aware of my reflection. It wasn't just a visual thing. It was a feeling, an overwhelming sense that something was watching me. Every time I passed a window, I couldn't help but glance at my reflection, half expecting it to do something strange again. But it never did. It just reflected me the way it should. Still, the fear lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. A week later, I passed the same window where the wave had happened. I tried to prepare myself for the worst, but nothing unusual happened. The window reflected my image just like any other. But as I walked away, I heard a faint sound behind me, A soft tap, like the sound of fingers against glass. My heart leaped in my chest, and I whirled around, but there was nothing. Only the window, reflecting the empty street. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened with my reflection wasn't over. I had thought it was just a fleeting moment, something my mind had created. But it felt like a warning, something that wasn't just in my head. Whatever had been waving at me wasn't done. It was waiting for me, just like it had before. And somehow, I knew I hadn't seen the last of it. Story 9. My favorite coffee shop added a drink to my receipt that I'd never ordered before. The cashier handed it to me without any acknowledgement of the mistake. At first I thought maybe it was an error, so I pointed it out. The drink was listed as something I didn't recognize, a name I'd never seen on their menu, and the cost was included in my total. I asked the cashier about it, but they just smiled and told me it must have been a special promotion they were running. I didn't recall hearing about any promotions, and the whole situation felt off. As I walked away, I tried to convince myself it was a harmless mistake, but the nagging doubt remained. The drink itself was something I could feel pressing on my mind. There was no way I had ordered it. I glanced down at the receipt again, focusing on the unfamiliar name, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a new item, or perhaps they were testing something. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't recall ever seeing that drink on the menu before, and I made a mental note to ask them the next time I visited. But when I looked up again, the cashier had already moved on to the next customer, and I was left standing there, holding my coffee and the strange receipt. The odd feeling lingered, but I shrugged it off and decided to leave. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt uneasy, as though something was subtly different. The usual warmth of the place had faded, and the hum of conversation around me seemed distant, like a low buzz in my ears. I walked down the street to my car, still thinking about the drink, but I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I had been going to that coffee shop for years, and nothing unusual had ever happened before. The day was normal, just like any other, so I decided to move on from it. Later that evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, I noticed a message from an unknown number. At first I thought it was spam, but then I saw the contents of the message. It simply said, "Did you like the drink?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about the drink or the strange receipt. It was a random message from an unknown number, with no explanation or context. The coincidence or whatever this was unsettling. I stared at the message for a while, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? Or was there something more to it? Whoever it was seemed to know what had happened at the coffee shop, and the timing was too precise to ignore. I replied with a simple "Who is this?" but didn't get a response. That's when the unease turned into full-blown paranoia. It was clear someone knew about the drink, and by extension they knew about me. My mind raced as I thought about the possibilities. Could someone have been watching me at the coffee shop? And could they have somehow overheard my order and used it against me? I had no idea, but the feeling of being watched intensified with every passing minute. The next day, I went back to the coffee shop. I tried to act casual, as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but my mind was racing. I asked the barista about the drink on the receipt, and they looked at me with confusion. "We don't have anything like that on the menu," they said, her voice laced with uncertainty. Maybe it was a mistake, or you got it at a different location. I was sure I had come to this location, the one I always went to, but the way she spoke made me question myself. Was I imagining things? Could it have been a mix-up? No, something wasn't adding up. The barista seemed to sense my discomfort and offered me a free drink for the trouble. I hesitated for a moment, but then accepted it, hoping the strange incident would somehow be explained away. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a strange sensation creeping in. It was as though I wasn't alone, even though the shop was busy and filled with other customers. My mind kept returning to the text message I'd received the night before. Who was watching me? How did they know about the drink? And why did it feel like I was being drawn into something bigger than a simple mistake? That evening, I received another message from the same unknown number. "I'll be watching you at Raid." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Who was this person? Why were they doing this? My pulse quickened, and I felt the familiar feeling of anxiety creeping up on me. The thought that someone was tracking my every move made it difficult to breathe. I tried to keep it together, but the messages made it clear that something wasn't right. I didn't know if it was a prank, a coincidence, or something more sinister, but I had a sinking feeling that the answer wasn't something I wanted to know. Over the following days, I stayed home more than usual. The thought of leaving the house and facing the unknown messages was too much to handle. The messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. The unknown number seemed to know everything about my daily routine, from where I went to what I bought. They knew when I was at the coffee shop, when I was at work, when I was heading home. It was as if they were following me, tracking my every move. The paranoia was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched constantly. I started changing my routine, taking different routes to work and avoiding the coffee shop altogether. But even then, the messages didn't stop. They continued to arrive at all hours of the day and night, each one more cryptic than the last. "You can't escape," one message read. "I know where you are." The fear was suffocating, and I couldn't stop myself from spiraling into a state of constant anxiety. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself for another message. I was losing control, and it felt like there was no way out. One night, after receiving yet another message, I decided I had had enough. I went to the police, explaining everything that had been happening. They took down my statement, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't take me seriously. They told me it could be a prank, that people sometimes do these things for attention. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Whoever was behind these messages wasn't just trying to scare me, they were trying to control me, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, I went to the coffee shop one last time. I stood in front of the counter, feeling like a stranger in a place I had once considered familiar. I looked at the barista, who was busy with another customer, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The memories of the strange drink and the unsettling messages still haunted me. As I left the shop, I glanced back, half expecting to see someone watching me from the window, but there was nothing. Just the quiet street and the dull hum of the city. The feeling of being watched never left, though. The messages stopped coming, but I couldn't shake the paranoia that had settled deep in my bones. It felt like someone was always a step behind me, lurking just out of sight. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run, the feeling of being watched never disappeared. I was left wondering if the person behind the messages had won, if they had gotten inside my head, and if I would ever truly feel safe again. Story 10. N. The evening was quiet, just the way I liked it. I had just finished dinner and was about to settle down with a book when my phone buzzed, interrupting the peaceful silence. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was an old number, one I hadn't used in years. The number seemed familiar in a way that I couldn't quite place, but I knew for certain that I hadn't had it activated for a long time. It was the number from a phone I had discarded after switching providers. I hesitated, staring at the screen as the call continued to ring. Something about it felt off, a strange pull that made me hesitate before answering. I'd never been superstitious, but this felt like a moment where intuition could mean something more. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and swiped the screen to answer. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound casual, but the moment the word left my lips, I felt a strange, creeping chill. There was no response on the other end of the line. Only silence, a soft crackling sound like static in the background. I waited, listening intently, but all I could hear was the low hum of the line. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was just a wrong number or some kind of technical glitch. I repeated myself. Hello? Hello? Still, no answer. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the call disconnected. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked the screen, seeing that the call had ended, but the number was still there. The same old number I hadn't used in years. I checked the call log and found that the number had appeared there, but there was no trace of the call anywhere else. No voicemail, no record of it being answered. It was as if the phone call had never happened. A strange unease washed over me, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a glitch, maybe even some spam or robocall. I put my phone down, but the feeling of discomfort lingered. It was too late for me to go out or call anyone, so I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept returning to the call. The next day, the call log still showed the strange number, and my curiosity began to grow. Who could have called me from that old number? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to figure it out. I couldn't remember the last time I'd used that number. It had been years, back when I was living in a different city, before I had switched to a new phone and a new provider. Why would that number be calling me now? I decided to check my old phone, the one that had been disconnected and stored away in the back of my closet for months. Maybe there was something on it that could explain the call. I dusted off the old phone, turned it on, and waited for it to boot up. The phone was sluggish, the screen cracked and worn from years of neglect. When it finally turned on, I tried to unlock it. I remembered the old password and entered it, surprised at how easily it came back to me. The screen flickered before showing me the home page. I scrolled through the old messages and contacts, but there was nothing unusual. The phone was just as I had left it, old texts from friends, photos of places I'd visited, but no clues about the strange phone call. I sat back, feeling more frustrated than before. There had to be something that made sense of this. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a wrong number. But then again, how had they gotten my old number? And why had they called me now, after all these years? I decided to reach out to my old provider, just to see if they could tell me anything about the number. I called their customer service line and explained the situation. After a long hold, the representative finally came on the line. "Thank you for calling. How can I help you today?" the representative said, her voice calm and professional. "I received a phone call from an old number of mine, one I haven't used in years. The call was disconnected when I tried to answer it. Do you have any record of this number being active?" She asked me for the number, and I provided it to her, trying to remain calm. "I'm sorry," she said after a brief pause. "Our records show that this number has been disconnected for several years, and it should no longer be in use." I couldn't understand it. If the number was disconnected, how could it be calling me now? "Are you sure there's no way someone could have activated it again?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "No, I'm afraid not," the representative replied. "Once a number is deactivated, it cannot be reactivated, and we don't have any record of it being reassigned to someone else." I thanked her for the information, but it didn't help. The call kept playing in my mind. Each time I tried to move on from it, I found myself circling back to the same thoughts. I decided to go one step further and call the number again, just to see if anyone would answer. I dialed the number, my fingers shaking as the phone rang. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I had to find out. The line rang several times before it clicked, and I held my breath. "Hello?" a voice said on the other end. I froze. It wasn't the same static from the night before. This time it was clear, and the voice was unmistakable. It was a man's voice, one I hadn't heard in years. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause before the man spoke again. "You shouldn't have called," he said, his voice calm but cold. "Some things are better left in the past." The line went dead, and I was left staring at the screen, my heart racing. I checked the number again. It was the same one. The call had ended just like the last one. For days, the calls stopped, but the strange encounter left a lingering sense of unease that wouldn't fade. I kept the old phone in the back of my drawer, the number I hadn't used in years still sitting there, waiting for the next time it might decide to call. Story 11. When I walked outside to get into my car that morning, I noticed something odd about my usual parking spot. There was a new sign that hadn't been there the day before, right in front of my car. The sign was plain, almost official looking, with white lettering on a black background. It said, "Reserved for," my name. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the sign. I didn't arrange for any special parking spot. In fact, I didn't even remember ever requesting anything like this. I stood frozen, my mind racing. How could this have happened? I had parked in this same spot for months, and nothing had ever been different. It was an ordinary parking space in an ordinary part of the parking lot. I looked around, expecting someone to be watching me, but no one was around. It was as if the sign had appeared overnight without any explanation. I didn't even know who would have put it there. There were no notes or any other identifying information attached to the sign. I checked the sign again, running my fingers over the letters, trying to find some clue as to why it was there. The surface felt smooth and cold, just like any regular sign, but the message was unsettling. I wasn't expecting this kind of attention, especially not for something as trivial as a parking spot. It almost felt like a violation, like someone had been watching me or planning something that I wasn't aware of. But who would do something like this? And why? I walked to my car, still glancing at the sign in confusion. As I got into the driver's seat, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. What did it mean? Was I being singled out for some reason? I had no idea who would have arranged something like this without my consent. There had been no prior communication, no heads up. I was left to wonder whether it was a mistake or something more intentional. I drove off, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone watching me from a distance. But the parking lot looked empty, as it always did. There were no other signs, no indication that anyone had noticed the one in my spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. It was as if something or someone had orchestrated this small change in my routine for a reason. The next day, the sign was still there. I arrived at the same time as usual, but now, the sign felt even more ominous. I parked my car in front of it, not knowing what to do. Should I contact someone? Maybe the building manager or the parking lot owners. I was hesitant. After all, it could just be a mistake, but what if it wasn't? What if someone had specifically targeted me? I couldn't ignore the growing anxiety every time I approached that spot. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no one watching from the windows of the building, but the feeling persisted. It was like a constant presence that I couldn't quite explain. I tried to focus on my day-to-day tasks, but every time I went to my car, my mind would drift back to the sign. The fact that my name was written on it made it feel personal, as though the person behind it knew exactly who I was and where I parked. That night, I decided to go to the building manager's office to ask about it. When I entered, the manager was busy with some paperwork, but they greeted me as I walked in. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to bring up the topic. I finally decided to ask, "Have you noticed the new sign in my parking spot?" The manager looked at me with confusion, raising an eyebrow. "What sign?" "The one that says reserved for my name," I said, feeling a bit self-conscious. I didn't request it, and I was wondering if you knew anything about it. The manager shrugged. "I haven't seen it. You sure it's not just some mistake? I'd suggest calling the parking lot service if it's bothering you. They handle all that kind of thing." I felt a bit uneasy at the manager's response. If the building manager didn't know about it, then who put the sign there? I nodded and left, but the feeling of unease only intensified. As I walked back to my apartment, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. I didn't feel like I was alone in that moment, but when I turned around, no one was there. The next day, I called the parking lot service, hoping they could shed some light on the situation. When I explained what had happened, the representative on the other end seemed just as confused as the manager had been. "We don't place any reserved signs without requests," they told me. "Are you sure someone else didn't make the request for you? Maybe a friend or a family member?" I shook my head, feeling even more unsettled. "No, I'm sure. I didn't arrange anything like that." "Well, there's not much we can do unless you get a written request from the person who did it," the representative said. "It could be a mistake, but we'll look into it." I hung up, frustrated. It was clear that no one had any answers, and the sign was still there, taunting me with its mysterious presence. I couldn't help but feel like I was being set up for something. Every time I passed that spot, I couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this than a simple mix-up. That evening, as I returned to the parking lot, I noticed something different. The sign had been moved. It was no longer in front of my usual spot, but had been placed at a different parking space, one I had never parked in before. My heart raced as I stood there, staring at the sign. This was getting weirder by the minute. Who was doing this, and why? I walked to my car, keeping a careful eye on the surroundings. The parking lot was still empty, with only a few cars scattered around. I checked the new spot where the sign had been placed and found that it was still labeled with my name. The feeling of dread intensified as I realized that this wasn't just some mistake, it was a deliberate act. Someone was playing games, and I had no idea why. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sign, the words haunting me, taunting me. Reserved for my name. Who had done it? And why? Was it a harmless prank or something more sinister? As I lay in bed, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the lot, its headlights briefly illuminating the room. I looked out the window, but the car was gone by the time I reached it. My pulse quickened as I realized that whoever was behind this might be closer than I thought. Story 12. I woke up to the soft hum of my smartwatch vibrating on my wrist, a subtle reminder that it was time to get up. As I reached for it, my eyes glanced at the screen, expecting to see the usual step count from the day before. But instead, a strange number appeared. The screen showed more steps than I had taken in the past 24 hours. Far more. Confused, I tapped the screen, thinking it was some kind of malfunction. The step count showed a surprising number, a number that didn't make sense. I had been sleeping the whole night, not moving an inch. So how was it that my smartwatch had tracked over 3,000 steps while I was asleep? I didn't recall getting up or walking around at any point during the night. I checked the time, realizing I had only been asleep for about 7 hours, not long enough to account for such a high number of steps. My heart began to race, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. This was impossible. My smartwatch had always been reliable, recording my movements accurately throughout the day, but this was something entirely different. I opened the activity log to investigate further. The steps were tracked in a perfectly consistent pattern, as if I had been walking around my house throughout the night. The times were listed, showing intervals every few minutes, all while I was supposed to be in bed, asleep. There was no explanation, no way that it could have happened. My mind started racing. Could someone have accessed my smartwatch while I was asleep? Had I somehow moved in my sleep and not remembered? But the thought didn't seem right. The movements were too deliberate, too coordinated to be a simple sleepwalking incident. It felt wrong. I decided to check the rest of the activity from the night. Maybe it was just a glitch, something my smartwatch had misinterpreted. But as I scrolled, the activity data grew even stranger. The recorded steps didn't follow my usual path around the house. Instead, they showed erratic movements. It was as though I had walked to places I had never gone. I went into the next room, staring at the step data in disbelief. It was tracking my movements to a place I didn't recognize. My mind flashed with worry. Had someone been in my house while I was asleep? Had someone else been using my smartwatch, tracking my every move? I checked my door locks, double-checked windows, and found everything secure, nothing disturbed. A thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if the steps weren't mine at all? I quickly checked the timestamps again, and my stomach dropped. The steps had been tracked in real time, during the very hours I had been in bed, unconscious. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, loud and unexpected. I jumped, my heart racing in my chest as I instinctively checked the smartwatch again. No new data, but the reminder of the unsettling pattern hung over me. With shaking hands, I went to the door, but when I opened it, no one was there. I felt uneasy as I stood there for a moment, glancing down at the porch. Nothing. Not even a package or a sign of someone having been there. I closed the door, bolting it behind me, and leaned against it for a few seconds, trying to calm myself. But my mind kept racing back to the steps. I had to figure out what was going on. I sat down on my couch, my smartwatch still resting on my wrist. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. What if this wasn't just a glitch? What if my smartwatch had somehow been hacked? Maybe someone had gained access to it remotely, tracking my movements, following me, even when I thought I was safe. After some time, I decided to look at the activity data one more time. As I scrolled through the logs, something caught my eye. The pattern of steps stopped at 3 mm. That was the last recorded movement. No more steps after that. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. Why had the activity stopped so abruptly? I stood up, pacing the room, trying to piece together what had happened. I tried to think of any other explanation. Could it be that the smartwatch malfunctioned? Could it be an issue with the sensors? But everything seemed to be working fine, and the movements were too deliberate for it to be a simple error. The unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach grew stronger with each passing minute. I had to know more. I grabbed my phone and opened the smartwatch app, checking the device's settings to ensure there were no issues. As I scrolled through the app, I noticed a strange setting I had never seen before, tracking active hours. It was switched on, but I couldn't remember ever enabling it. It was set to track movements even while I was sleeping. How could I have missed that? I never recalled activating it, and it seemed odd that the app would automatically track my movements without my consent. I quickly turned off the feature, but the nagging feeling of something being wrong didn't go away. Later that day, I tried to push it out of my mind. I went through the motions of the day, trying to forget about the strange steps that had been tracked while I was asleep. But it kept coming back to me. Every time I glanced at the smartwatch on my wrist, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching. That night, I kept my smartwatch off, placing it on the charging dock far away from my bed. I didn't want to risk anything happening again, though a part of me was still uncertain. I had to know who or what was behind this, and I couldn't rest until I figured it out. In the silence of the night, I eventually fell into a restless sleep. But just as I began to drift off, the smartwatch buzzed on the charging dock. Startled, I shot up in bed and grabbed it, hoping it wasn't another strange notification. The screen flashed a new message. It wasn't from a number or an app I recognized. The message simply read, "I'm still watching you." I froze, the words sending a cold shiver through my body. How had this happened? What was going on? I turned the smartwatch off immediately, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after the screen went dark. My mind raced with fear, but I couldn't shake the question who was following me, even in my sleep. Story 13. It was just after sunset when I first saw it. The street lights had flickered on, casting a soft orange glow along the sidewalk. I was walking back home from the corner store, my bag filled with groceries, when I noticed something out of place. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint mark on the concrete, but as I got closer, I saw it more clearly. Someone had drawn an arrow on the sidewalk with bright white chalk, and the point of the arrow was aimed directly at my house. I stopped in my tracks, the groceries in my hand suddenly feeling heavier. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from a distance, but there was no one. The street was eerily quiet, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of cars passing by. I bent down to get a closer look at the arrow. It was fresh, the chalk still a little dusty, but the lines were clear and sharp. The arrow was unmistakably pointing in the direction of my front door. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whoever had drawn it knew exactly where I lived. My heart began to race, and a million thoughts flooded my mind. Who had done this? And why? Was it a prank or something more? I looked up at my house. The familiar sight of my porch light shining through the window only made the situation feel more unsettling. I glanced around again, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had left the mark, but there was nothing. No one in sight. The street, usually full of neighbors and cars, felt unnervingly still. I debated going inside, but a feeling of dread settled over me, urging me to stay where I was. I stood there for a moment longer, the arrow on the sidewalk seeming to grow bigger, more ominous the longer I stared at it. I had no idea what it meant, but something deep inside told me it wasn't something I could ignore. I glanced around one last time, then quickly made my way to my front door. I felt as though I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I walked. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, but the unease didn't fade. I set the groceries down, my hands trembling slightly, and walked over to the window to peek outside. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see the sidewalk again. The arrow was still there, unmistakable and clear, pointing directly toward my home. The street was quiet as ever. No one seemed to be near it, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned away from the window, my mind racing. It was just an arrow, I told myself. It could have been a random mark, a child playing with chalk, or a harmless prank. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, intentional. Whoever had done this had been watching me, had planned it out carefully. But why? What message were they trying to send? My thoughts kept spiraling in circles, and I couldn't seem to make sense of any of it. As the evening wore on, I tried to distract myself. I made dinner, watched a show, even texted a few friends, but nothing could shake the feeling of unease that lingered in my chest. The arrow kept appearing in my mind as though it was etched into my thoughts. I knew I should just let it go, ignore it, but it wasn't that simple. The more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more it consumed my thoughts. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to go outside to check the arrow again. I needed to see it for myself one more time, to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I slipped on my shoes and quietly unlocked the door. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, the quiet of the neighborhood almost deafening. I pointed the flashlight toward the sidewalk, the beam cutting through the darkness. The arrow was still there, just as clear as before. I kneeled down, my heart pounding in my chest. It looked harmless, just chalk on concrete, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. I scanned the area again, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but there was nothing. The street was empty, just as it had been earlier. I stood up and took a step back, my eyes still locked on the arrow. There was something about it, something about the way it seemed to point directly to my house, that made me feel more and more uneasy. Suddenly, I heard a rustle behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I spun around, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I searched for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the only sound I could hear was the wind, and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I couldn't stand it anymore. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me, my hand shaking as I locked it once again. I bolted the deadbolt and leaned against the door, trying to calm my breathing. What was happening? Who had drawn that arrow? And why? I couldn't answer any of those questions, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. It was like someone was lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something I wasn't ready for. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every little sound, every creak of the house felt amplified in the silence of the night. The arrow, the strange feeling of being followed, it all kept playing in my head. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like I was in the middle of some twisted game, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. The next morning I checked the sidewalk again. The arrow was gone. It had disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. But that only left me with more questions. Had I imagined it, or had it been erased? Either way, I couldn't forget the feeling, the chilling certainty that someone had been watching me, had been planning something. And no matter what happened next, I knew that I hadn't seen the last of it. Story 14. I was sitting in the living room, sipping my coffee, when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the door. It wasn't the usual noise of wind or leaves, but something different, something that made me freeze for a moment. I set the cup down and got up, walking slowly toward the front door. As I peered through the peephole, I saw nothing. The porch outside was empty. The only thing visible was the dim light from the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But when I opened the door to check, I found a small, folded note lying on the ground just outside. I picked it up cautiously, feeling a shiver run through me. The paper was thin, almost delicate, and had no envelope. As I unfolded it, I saw the words written in neat, precise handwriting. "You left this outside." My stomach dropped. What could that possibly mean? I hadn't been outside in hours, and I definitely hadn't left anything out there. I looked down at the note again, scanning it for any other information, but there was nothing else. No return address. No signature. Just those 5 words. I stepped outside, my eyes darting around the porch, searching for anything that might explain the note. But there was nothing. No package, no sign of anything I might have forgotten. Nothing that could give me a clue as to why the note had been left. I closed the door behind me and locked it, my mind racing. Was someone playing a prank on me? I thought back to the last few days, trying to recall if I had done anything unusual. But everything seemed normal. I had spent the morning cleaning the house and running errands, and the evening was uneventful. The only thing that had been out of the ordinary was the note itself. It felt too strange to be a coincidence. I sat back down on the couch, the note still in my hands. I tried to focus on the TV, but my thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened. Who had left the note? How had they known where to leave it? And why would they say I had left this outside when there was nothing there? My eyes flicked nervously to the window as I wondered if someone was watching me. It wasn't like I lived in a neighborhood where things like this happened. It was quiet, peaceful, and most people kept to themselves. The more I thought about it, the more the note seemed to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if someone knew something I didn't. But how could that be possible? I didn't think anyone was following me, and I hadn't received any strange phone calls or messages. It was as though the note had come from nowhere, with no explanation or reason behind it. I stood up again, pacing around the room, trying to make sense of the situation. I decided to check the security camera footage, just to see if anything unusual had happened while I wasn't looking. I opened the app and scrolled through the recordings, but there was nothing that stood out. No one had been near my door. The footage showed the usual, just cars passing by and people walking their dogs. Then, as I was about to turn off the camera feed, something caught my eye. In the corner of the screen, there was a shadow moving across the porch just as I was sitting on the couch, sipping my coffee. The figure was quick, almost too fast to catch. It appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye, just as I had heard the rustling noise earlier. I rewound the footage, watching it again. The figure was wearing a dark coat, and I couldn't make out any details, but it seemed to be walking towards my door. I stared at the screen, heart racing. Was this person the one who had left the note? But how had they gotten so close without me noticing? How had they left the note without me hearing them? The mystery deepened, and I felt a growing sense of dread settle in my chest. I wanted to convince myself that it was just a harmless prank, but something about it felt wrong, like I was missing a piece of the puzzle. The more I thought about it, the more the fear crept in. I hadn't heard the doorbell ring, hadn't heard any footsteps outside. Whoever had left the note had done so silently, without leaving a trace. They had known where to place the note, and yet there was no reason for it to be there. I tried to remind myself that there had to be a logical explanation, but I couldn't come up with one. Nothing made sense. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. I needed a break from the confusion, a moment to step away from the strange feeling that had settled over me. As I walked, I kept thinking about the note, the figure on the footage, and the eerie silence that had followed. I tried to calm my nerves, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. When I returned home, I found that the note was still sitting on the coffee table where I had left it. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Something told me that it was important, that I needed to keep it, even if I didn't understand why. It felt like a warning, like someone was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. But what could that possibly be? The next few days passed in a blur. The note haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. Every time I opened the door, I half expected to find another note waiting for me. But nothing else came. The silence was deafening, and the mystery of the note never left my mind. Then, a week later, I received another one. It was slipped under my door just like the first, but this time, the message was different. It read, "You were right to keep the note." My heart raced as I read the words. Whoever was leaving these notes knew things they shouldn't, and that was enough to make me fear for my safety. I knew something was coming, and I didn't know how to stop it. Story 15. It had been one of those quiet, uneventful evenings. The kind where everything felt still, almost too still. The kind where you can hear every little sound in the house, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional creak of the floorboards shifting beneath you. I was at home alone, having decided to stay in and get some work done. The house was empty, save for me, and the silence was almost comforting. I had made myself a cup of tea and settled down at the kitchen table to work. I remember the moment it happened so clearly. I was typing away, focused on the task at hand, when I heard something. It was soft at first, a voice, but it sounded like mine. I froze. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind making strange noises. But no, it wasn't that. It was a voice, clear and distinct, speaking from another room. The strangest part was that it was my voice. The words were unmistakable, the tone identical to mine. I sat there for a moment, staring at the doorway that led to the living room. I could hear the voice clearly now, as if it were right in front of me. "You need to stop worrying," it said, calm and reassuring. "Everything is fine." But I hadn't spoken. I hadn't said a word. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I slowly stood up from the table. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. What was happening? I cautiously made my way toward the living room, each step feeling like it took longer than the last. The voice was still there, faint but unmistakable, coming from the far side of the room where the hallway met the bathroom. I stopped at the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. I was alone. The living room was empty. There was no one there. The voice continued, now sounding even more like me, but it was speaking words I didn't recognize. "It's going to be okay," it said, just as I heard it before. But there was something strange about it now, a sense of familiarity I couldn't quite place. It was as though it was me, but not me. I looked around, my mind in a whirlwind. I had to be imagining it. I had to be. My mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of that, the voice continued, soft and steady, as though it had been there all along. "Don't be afraid," it said again, and my hands shook as I clenched them by my sides. I turned around and made my way toward the hallway, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what could possibly be in my house. The only other people who had a key were my parents, and they were miles away. There was no way they could be here. The voice was still there. The words it spoke became clearer as I reached the doorway to the bathroom, but I didn't want to look. I couldn't. But something inside of me urged me on, something that didn't make sense, something that felt like an instinct I had to follow. I took a deep breath and stepped into the bathroom. The room was just as I had left it. No one was there. But the voice, it was louder now, as if it were right next to me. I could feel it in the air, the vibrations of my own words surrounding me. "You need to listen to yourself," it said. "Trust yourself." I spun around, my head spinning with confusion. There was no one else here. It was just me. The voice grew quieter, as though it were retreating into the walls themselves. I could still hear it faintly, but it was almost like a whisper now, a soft echo of something that didn't belong. I quickly left the bathroom and went back to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone from the table. I needed to call someone. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But when I picked up the phone, my heart sank. The call log was empty. I hadn't dialed anyone, not in hours. I checked my messages, the ones from earlier in the day, but nothing had changed. Everything was as it should be. No missed calls, no new messages. The voice had stopped now, but the sense of unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. What had I just heard? Had I imagined it? Was I going crazy? I tried to calm myself down, but the feeling that something wasn't right lingered, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, trying to focus on anything other than the eerie experience I had just had. The voice didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Later that night, I tried to sleep, but the strange sensation followed me. I couldn't tell if I was hearing things in the dark, or if I was simply too terrified to close my eyes. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every rustle of leaves outside seemed like a whisper in the shadows. The voice, though absent, echoed in my mind, haunting me. In the weeks that followed, things seemed to return to normal. The voice never came back, and I convinced myself it had been a trick of the mind. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, or maybe I had been so stressed that my mind had created an illusion. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, a part of me knew that it hadn't been just my imagination. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in my house that night. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe it was me, or maybe it was something else entirely. But one thing was for certain. I couldn't forget what I had heard. The sound of my own voice, speaking from another room, was something that would stay with me forever. Story 16. To lie. I had just gotten home after a long day at work, feeling exhausted and ready to relax. The moment I stepped through the door, I noticed something strange. The air in the hallway felt warm, uncomfortably so. It wasn't unbearable, but it was a noticeable difference from the cool temperature I usually kept the house at. I figured the thermostat had somehow malfunctioned, so I reached for my phone to check the temperature settings. The thermostat, as expected, showed the current temperature of the house, a comfortable 72 degrees. But when I checked the individual room readings, something odd stood out. The temperature in the guest room was set at 78 degrees, a good 6 degrees warmer than the rest of the house. That was strange. The guest room hadn't been used in weeks. In fact, no one had been in there since the last time I had guests over, which was over a month ago. I decided to go and check it out. Maybe there was something I had missed, perhaps the window had been left open, or a heating vent had somehow been left on. But when I reached the door of the guest room, everything seemed normal. I opened the door and was immediately hit by the warm air. The room was unusually warm, almost stuffy, but there was no reason for it. I walked over to the thermostat on the wall of the room, and it read exactly what the main thermostat had shown. 78 degrees. Everything else in the room appeared as it always had. The bed, neatly made, was undisturbed. The curtains were drawn, blocking any sunlight from entering. No windows were open. There was nothing in the room that could explain the temperature difference. I checked the vents, hoping to find an explanation there, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The air wasn't coming from anywhere else, and the heater hadn't been turned on. I stood in the room for a while, feeling the warmth surround me, but it didn't make sense. The thermostat in the room hadn't been tampered with, and the rest of the house was cool, as it always was. It was as if the room itself had somehow become warmer, as though something inside it was heating up. I left the room and went back to the hallway. I checked the main thermostat again, and sure enough, it still showed the same reading. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but it left me feeling uneasy. I sat down on the couch in the living room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. The warm air from the guest room still lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The next morning, the temperature in the guest room was normal again. It was the same as the rest of the house, 72 degrees. I figured maybe it was just a glitch, something to do with the thermostat. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. It didn't make sense. Why had the room been so warm the night before? And why had it happened when no one had even been in there? A week later, the same thing happened again. I had just come home from running errands and noticed the same warmth in the hallway. I checked the thermostat, and once again, the guest room showed a higher temperature. I walked into the room, and the air was thick with warmth, much hotter than the rest of the house. It felt as if the room was holding on to heat that shouldn't have been there. I checked everything once again, no windows, no open vents, no signs of anything unusual. Yet the temperature remained high. This time I decided to keep track of the temperature. Over the next few days I would go into the room at random times, checking the thermostat and recording the temperature. It didn't matter if I had the air conditioning on or if the house was cooler than usual. The guest room's temperature would fluctuate in strange ways. Sometimes it would go up without explanation, even though the rest of the house remained comfortable. Other times it would drop back to normal as quickly as it had risen. It was becoming unnerving. I didn't know if the house was somehow malfunctioning or if there was something else happening. I began to wonder if I was imagining it. Maybe I was just tired, stressed from work, or overly paranoid. But the pattern continued. I checked the thermostat every day, and the guest room was always the same, out of sync with the rest of the house. Then one night, something happened that made me question everything. I had been in bed for a few hours, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a strange noise. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, a soft clicking sound, like something tapping on the wall. It sounded like it was coming from the guest room. I couldn't ignore it. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and went to investigate. As I approached the guest room, the air grew warmer again, just like the previous times. But this time, the clicking sound was more pronounced, almost rhythmic, as if someone or something was tapping on the walls of the room. I opened the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The light from the hallway illuminated the room, but it looked the same as it always did, empty and still. The clicking stopped as soon as I stepped inside, but the warmth was still there. It enveloped me, heavy and thick. My mind raced, and I backed out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I stood in the hallway, staring at the room. Something was off, something that I couldn't explain. I couldn't bring myself to go back in there, not after hearing that sound. The next day, I decided to call a professional to come and check the heating system. I needed answers, or at least an explanation. The technician arrived and checked the thermostat, the vents, the entire heating system. He found nothing wrong. No malfunctions, no glitches, nothing that could account for the strange temperature fluctuations. He left, scratching his head in confusion, but reassuring me that everything seemed fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain what I had heard, what I had felt, or why the guest room kept heating up when it shouldn't. The house was fine as far as the technician was concerned, but to me, it didn't feel right. Over the next few weeks, the temperature in the guest room remained normal again, but I couldn't forget the strange occurrences. The clicking sound, the warmth that seemed to have no explanation, and the feeling of being watched, like something was hiding just behind the walls. I kept the door to the guest room closed, but the memory lingered. What was going on in that room? And why did it feel like it was holding on to something I couldn't see? Something I didn't want to understand. Story 17. I had just stepped out of the apartment, enjoying the brisk evening air as I made my way down the street. I had no particular destination in mind, just walking to clear my head. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from a friend reminding me of a meeting later that night. I typed a quick response, slipping my phone back into my bag as I continued walking, lost in thought. That's when I heard the sound of a car slowly pulling up beside me. I glanced to my right, expecting to see someone looking for directions or a person I might know. Instead, I saw a yellow cab slowly rolling to a stop in front of me. The driver's eyes locked on mine through the rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it at first. I had probably seen the driver somewhere before, or maybe he was just being polite. But then, before I could say a word, he spoke. "Good evening, Jen," he said with a slight smile, as if greeting an old friend. My heart skipped a beat. I had never seen this man before in my life, and I certainly hadn't called for a ride. I stood frozen, staring at him, my mind racing. How did he know my name? Was it a coincidence? Maybe he had overheard me talking on the phone earlier when I had introduced myself. But I quickly dismissed that idea. I had been alone and I hadn't spoken to anyone in person all day. I cleared my throat, still unsure of how to respond. "Excuse me, but how do you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse was quickening. The driver chuckled lightly, as if the situation was perfectly normal. "Oh, I've been driving you for a while now. You must have forgotten. Hop in, it's cold out here." I shook my head, trying to make sense of the situation. "No, I don't think so," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I haven't called a cab." My mind was spinning. I looked around to make sure I wasn't missing anything. There were no other cabs nearby, no signs of anyone else who might have been expecting a ride. Just the solitary yellow cab sitting in front of me. The driver seemed unbothered by my hesitation. His smile remained, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. It was as though he knew something I didn't, something personal. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of déjà vu, but I couldn't place it. "Come on, don't be shy. I'm here to take you where you need to go," he said, his voice oddly comforting yet laced with an undertone of something more. The way he spoke felt rehearsed, too smooth to be genuine. I took a step back, my instincts telling me that something wasn't right. "No, I'm fine, thank you," I said firmly, but the words came out weaker than I had intended. I glanced around again, hoping someone would see what was happening, but the street was deserted. The cab driver didn't seem to mind. He just sat there staring at me through the mirror, waiting patiently for me to change my mind. "Jen," he repeated softly, his tone still friendly, but now with a hint of urgency. "I'm not going to bite. You know you're supposed to get in. It's time." The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the way he said it, but the sense of certainty, as though he knew something that I didn't. As though he knew I was supposed to be getting in that cab, as though it was some sort of fate I couldn't avoid. I could feel my breath quickening as the realization hit me. I didn't know this man. I had never been in his cab before, and I certainly had never arranged for a ride. This wasn't a coincidence. There was something off about this entire situation. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and for a brief moment, I considered running, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my mind racing for an explanation. The driver paused, his smile faltering for just a second, before it returned, wider this time. "I'm just here to help. You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice low and soothing. "But if you're not ready yet, that's okay. I'll be waiting." I stood there frozen, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. For what felt like an eternity, I just stared at him, trying to comprehend what was happening. Finally, I turned and took a step away from the cab, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jen," the driver called after me, his voice almost too gentle. "You don't need to worry. You'll get in eventually. We always meet again." I quickened my pace, not daring to look back. My heart was racing, and my breath was shallow. What had just happened? Who was that man? Why did he know my name? And how did he know I was supposed to get into that cab? I couldn't make sense of it. It felt like I had just experienced something that defied logic, something that left me shaken to my core. I didn't stop walking until I reached my apartment building. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I leaned against the wall. I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself that it was just a weird encounter, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had been in control of the situation, but it hadn't felt that way. It had felt like I was being watched, like someone knew more about me than I did myself. Later that night, I checked my phone, hoping to find some sort of distraction. As I scrolled through my notifications, I found an email from an unknown address. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The subject line simply read, "I'll be waiting." There was no body text, just the message, "You'll come with me soon. It's only a matter of time." My stomach churned as I read the words. How did this person know what had just happened? How had they found me? I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized one thing: whoever that driver was, he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had been following me. And no matter how far I ran, it seemed like he would always find me. Story 18. I had just stepped out of the apartment, enjoying the brisk evening air as I made my way down the street. I had no particular destination in mind, just walking to clear my head. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from a friend reminding me of a meeting later that night. I typed a quick response, slipping my phone back into my bag as I continued walking, lost in thought. That's when I heard the sound of a car slowly pulling up beside me. I glanced to my right, expecting to see someone looking for directions or a person I might know. Instead, I saw a yellow cab slowly rolling to a stop in front of me. The driver's eyes locked on mine through the rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it at first. I had probably seen the driver somewhere before, or maybe he was just being polite. But then, before I could say a word, he spoke. "Good evening, Jen," he said with a slight smile, as if greeting an old friend. My heart skipped a beat. I had never seen this man before in my life, and I certainly hadn't called for a ride. I stood frozen, staring at him, my mind racing. How did he know my name? Was it a coincidence? Maybe he had overheard me talking on the phone earlier when I had introduced myself. But I quickly dismissed that idea. I had been alone and I hadn't spoken to anyone in person all day. I cleared my throat, still unsure of how to respond. "Excuse me, but how do you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse was quickening. The driver chuckled lightly, as if the situation was perfectly normal. "Oh, I've been driving you for a while now. You must have forgotten. Hop in, it's cold out here." I shook my head, trying to make sense of the situation. "No, I don't think so," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I haven't called a cab." My mind was spinning. I looked around to make sure I wasn't missing anything. There were no other cabs nearby, no signs of anyone else who might have been expecting a ride. Just the solitary yellow cab sitting in front of me. The driver seemed unbothered by my hesitation. His smile remained, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. It was as though he knew something I didn't, something personal. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of déjà vu, but I couldn't place it. "Come on, don't be shy. I'm here to take you where you need to go," he said, his voice oddly comforting yet laced with an undertone of something more. The way he spoke felt rehearsed, too smooth to be genuine. I took a step back, my instincts telling me that something wasn't right. "No, I'm fine, thank you," I said firmly, but the words came out weaker than I had intended. I glanced around again, hoping someone would see what was happening, but the street was deserted. The cab driver didn't seem to mind. He just sat there, staring at me through the mirror, waiting patiently for me to change my mind. "Jen," he repeated softly, his tone still friendly, but now with a hint of urgency. "I'm not going to bite. You know you're supposed to get in. It's time." The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the way he said it, but the sense of certainty, as though he knew something that I didn't. As though he knew I was supposed to be getting in that cab, as though it was some sort of fate I couldn't avoid. I could feel my breath quickening as the realization hit me. I didn't know this man. I had never been in his cab before, and I certainly had never arranged for a ride. This wasn't a coincidence. There was something off about this entire situation. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and for a brief moment, I considered running, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my mind racing for an explanation. The driver paused, his smile faltering for just a second before it returned, wider this time. "I'm just here to help. You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice low and soothing. "But if you're not ready yet, that's okay. I'll be waiting." I stood there frozen, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. For what felt like an eternity, I just stared at him, trying to comprehend what was happening. Finally, I turned and took a step away from the cab, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jen," the driver called after me, his voice almost too gentle. "You don't need to worry. You'll get in eventually. We always meet again." I quickened my pace, not daring to look back. My heart was racing, and my breath was shallow. What had just happened? Who was that man? Why did he know my name, and how did he know I was supposed to get into that cab? I couldn't make sense of it. It felt like I had just experienced something that defied logic, something that left me shaken to my core. I didn't stop walking until I reached my apartment building. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I leaned against the wall. I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself that it was just a weird encounter, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had been in control of the situation, but it hadn't felt that way. It had felt like I was being watched, like someone knew more about me than I did myself. Later that night, I checked my phone, hoping to find some sort of distraction. As I scrolled through my notifications, I found an email from an unknown address. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The subject line simply read, "I'll be waiting." There was no body text, just the message, "You'll come with me soon. It's only a matter of time." My stomach churned as I read the words. How did this person know what had just happened? How had they found me? I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized one thing. Whoever that driver was, he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had been following me. And no matter how far I ran, it seemed like he would always find me. Story 19. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when a message notification popped up. It was from an unknown number, which in itself wasn't unusual. But what caught my attention was the photo attached to it. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the image. It was a photo of the view from my living room window. I knew that view well through the glass. I could see the large oak tree in the front yard and the old street lamp across the street. But what chilled me to the bone was that the photo seemed to have been taken from a position I couldn't recall. I hadn't taken this photo myself, and there was no reason anyone should have it. The text accompanying it was simple, just 2 words, "I'm here." I stared at the screen, trying to process what was happening. I immediately rushed to my window and peered outside, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the street was empty. The chill that had crept over me didn't fade, though. I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched, but there was no one in sight. My hands trembled as I scrolled back up to the message, the image still staring back at me. How could someone have gotten that shot? My mind raced through every possibility. Had someone been standing in my yard, or worse, peeking through my window? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was some sort of prank, maybe even someone who had taken a picture of my house while passing by. But the idea didn't sit right with me. The photo was too perfect, too clear. There was no way someone could have captured that angle without being inside my yard or somewhere far too close. The timing of it all was also strange. The photo had been sent while I was sitting alone in my living room. How could they have known where I was? A part of me considered contacting the police, but I didn't have any solid evidence. No one had physically entered my home, and there was nothing I could point to as concrete proof of a threat. Yet the image and the message lingered in my mind, making my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the evening with the blinds drawn and the lights off, hoping that whoever had sent the photo would just leave me alone. But the feeling of unease never left. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise in the house seemed to amplify the creaking of the floorboards, the rustling of the curtains. I kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, but each time I felt like something wasn't right. My phone sat on the table beside me, and I couldn't help but glance at it, half expecting another message. But nothing came. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a random coincidence. But in the back of my mind, I knew this was something more. The next day, I went about my usual routine, but the incident weighed heavily on my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of the photo, and it seemed to follow me wherever I went. Every time I walked by a window, I would check outside, wondering if someone was lurking in the shadows. But there was never anyone there. I convinced myself that I was just overreacting, that it was nothing more than a strange coincidence. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then, that afternoon, another message arrived. This time, there was no photo, just the same 2 words, "I'm closer." My stomach dropped, and I felt a wave of panic rush through me. How could they be closer? What did that even mean? I looked around my house, half expecting someone to jump out at me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like everything I did was being watched. I considered taking action, but I didn't know where to start. I had no idea who this person was, or how they had gotten so close. The idea of calling the police seemed pointless, given that all I had was a strange message and a photo of my own view. They'd probably think I was paranoid or overreacting. But the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger with each passing hour. I knew I had to do something. I decided to leave the house for a while, hoping that being outside would help me clear my head. I went to a nearby park and walked aimlessly, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. But as I sat down on a bench, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it from my pocket, my heart pounding in my chest. This time there was no message, no photo, just a single word now. I stood up, panic surging through me. What did this mean? Was I being followed? Had someone found me? I rushed back to my car and drove home as quickly as I could, my eyes scanning the streets for any sign of someone watching me. When I arrived, I immediately checked the locks again, double-checking that everything was secure. I glanced out the window, still feeling that nagging sensation that someone was out there, watching. But there was nothing. The street was empty, just like it had been the night before. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination running wild, but the fear lingered, clawing at me from the inside. The messages continued, each one more cryptic than the last. I see you became a recurring theme, and each time they arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was closing in on me. The fear slowly morphed into a constant state of dread. I couldn't go anywhere without checking over my shoulder. I couldn't sleep without feeling like someone was lurking just outside my door. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, and I started to question my own sanity. I tried to block the number, but the messages still came. It didn't matter what I did, they kept finding their way through. I felt trapped, like I was being pushed into a corner with no way out. Whoever this person was, they knew too much. They knew where I lived, where I went, and now it felt like they knew everything about me. One day, while I was sitting in my living room, I heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped. No one ever knocked without warning, and I hadn't been expecting anyone. I crept cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. But as I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, folded piece of paper was left on the doorstep. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I opened it. Inside it read, "I'm watching." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some random person or prank. Whoever was behind this had been here in my home, and I didn't know how to stop them. Story 20. Allah. I woke up that morning with the usual sense of unease, the weight of a long, restless night hanging over me. I had spent hours tossing and turning, and when I finally managed to fall asleep, it was no better. The dreams had been vivid, almost too real, and as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I noticed something strange in the pocket of my jacket. I hadn't worn that jacket in days, so the feel of something in the pocket was unexpected. My hand instinctively reached for it, pulling out a business card that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. It was simple, just a clean white card with bold, black text that read, "Call me when you're ready." There was no name, no number, no company listed, just those words. At first I thought it was a mistake. Maybe it was left in the pocket by someone else, perhaps a friend or a colleague. But the more I stared at it, the more unsettled I became. The card was so out of place, so personal. I didn't know anyone who would leave a cryptic message like that for me. I couldn't remember a time when I had received a business card like this. I sat down at the kitchen table, the card still in my hand, my thoughts racing. My mind searched for an explanation. Could it be from someone I had met recently? Had I perhaps forgotten about a conversation with someone who had given it to me? I checked my phone for any messages or notifications, but there was nothing that could explain it. I picked up the card again, turning it over in my hands. Still nothing on the back. Just the simple phrase that seemed to weigh heavily in the silence of my home. Call me when you're ready. The words were too ominous to ignore, but I had no clue what they meant or who they were meant for. The day dragged on as I tried to forget about the card, to move on with my life. But every time I reached into my pocket or grabbed my jacket, the card would resurface in my mind. It felt like it was calling to me, urging me to do something. But what? As the days passed, I grew increasingly uneasy. I didn't know if I should call the number, or if I even should try to track down the person who had left it. But there was a growing curiosity inside me. Who would leave such an unusual message? What was it that they wanted from me? Then, one evening, as I was sitting in my living room, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat as I stood up and walked to the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it cautiously, and there, standing on my doorstep, was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious expression. He was holding a small package in his hands. "I have something for you," he said simply, his voice calm and direct. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at him, trying to place him. I didn't know him, yet there was something about his presence that felt familiar, almost as if I had been expecting him. He handed me the package without another word. As I took it, I noticed the same phrase written on the outside of the box, "Call me when you're ready." My mind raced. This had to be connected to the business card, but how? I glanced back at the man, but he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of the street. I stood there in the doorway, holding the package, too stunned to speak. I closed the door slowly and walked to the living room, placing the package on the table. I stared at it for a long moment before slowly peeling back the tape. Inside there was another business card, identical to the one I had found in my jacket pocket. But this time, the words were different. "You know what to do now." The weight of those words hung in the air like a challenge. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. This wasn't some harmless mistake or coincidence. Whoever was behind this had been watching me. They knew who I was, and they wanted something from me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The curiosity gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing minute. I had to know what this was about. I had to know who was behind it. I stood up and walked to the phone, the business card still in my hand. I dialed the number, feeling a strange sense of calm, despite the overwhelming fear bubbling inside me. The line rang once, twice, before a voice picked up on the other end. "Are you ready?" the voice asked. I froze, unable to respond at first. The voice was calm, almost too calm, as though they had been waiting for this moment. I began, my voice shaking. "Who is this?" There was a pause, and then the voice responded, "That's not important. What matters is that you're ready now. You know what you have to do." I was speechless. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but it felt like I was stumbling through a fog. The voice continued, "This is just the beginning. You've already made your choice, whether you know it or not. Just follow the path, and everything will make sense." The line went dead. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the phone still pressed to my ear, the eerie silence of the room suffocating me. What had just happened? What had I just agreed to? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch and loom. Every noise seemed too loud, too close. The phone calls kept coming, Each time, the voice would say the same thing: "You know what to do now." I had no idea what they wanted from me, no idea what path I had chosen or what was waiting at the end. All I knew was that I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Story 21. I sat at my desk working through the pile of emails that had accumulated while I was busy the day before. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where time seemed to stretch endlessly. I was the only one in the office, having arrived early to catch up on some things before the rest of the team showed up. The room was still, the hum of the computer being the only sound. As I sifted through the paperwork, something caught my eye on the desk. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, placed just next to my keyboard. At first, I thought it might be something I had forgotten to discard, but as I picked it up, I saw that it wasn't just any scrap of paper. It was a handwritten note. The message was brief, just a few words written in neat, careful handwriting: "Nice outfit." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone all day. There had been no one around when I arrived, and I hadn't heard anyone enter the office since then. The office was small, with only one entrance that I had been watching. There was no way anyone could have snuck in without me noticing. And yet here was a note, specifically addressed to me, complimenting my outfit. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning the corners and the door, half expecting someone to pop out from behind the filing cabinet or to hear a giggle from the other side of the room. But no one was there. The place was eerily silent. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as though someone were watching me, but there was no one. I stared at the note for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. It didn't seem malicious, just strange. The handwriting was familiar but not immediately recognizable. It wasn't like anyone from the office, nor did it seem like something a friend or family member would write. I hadn't spoken to anyone in person that day, so how could they have seen what I was wearing? I set the note down on the desk, trying to focus on my work again, but my mind kept wandering back to it. It was unsettling, a small, seemingly harmless comment, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. Who had left it? And why? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the room with me, watching me without my knowledge. Hours passed, and the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The note remained where I had left it, but the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed like a clue, something that was trying to tell me something. Maybe it was nothing more than a prank, a harmless joke from a coworker who had come in early and left before I noticed. But deep down, I knew it felt off. The timing didn't add up. How could anyone have been in here without me hearing them? As I looked at the note again, a thought occurred to me. What if it wasn't meant to be a compliment? What if it was meant to be a warning, or some kind of message I was supposed to decode? I could feel my pulse quicken at the thought. There was something in the air, something strange and unexplainable, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. By the time the rest of the team started filtering into the office, I had pushed the note to the back of my mind. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't help glancing around, still waiting for an explanation. No one said anything about the note. No one mentioned that they had seen me at all that morning, nor did anyone seem to acknowledge my outfit, which I thought was unusual given the specific nature of the comment on the note. That afternoon, I decided to leave the office a bit earlier than usual. I had enough work done for the day, and the strange feeling that had been building all day was starting to feel overwhelming. I grabbed my things and made my way out of the office, but as I passed the front desk on my way out, I stopped in my tracks. There, on the counter, was another handwritten note. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked it up. This note was different. It didn't say anything at first glance. It was simply folded neatly in half. But when I opened it, there was a single line written inside, "I'm still here." My stomach dropped. The words seemed to echo in my mind, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The first note had been strange, but this was different. It felt like something more sinister, a warning that had been left intentionally for me to find. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I quickly left the office, the note clutched tightly in my hand. As I walked out into the parking lot, I looked around, half expecting someone to be following me. I got in my car and locked the doors, but the unease lingered, making every noise around me sound louder than it should have. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I jumped, pulling it out quickly to see who had messaged me. It was a text from an unknown number, "You're not alone." I felt my heart start to race. The notes, the texts, it was all too much. Someone was watching me, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I tried to convince myself that it was just a prank, but deep down I knew it was something more. I didn't feel safe anymore. There was no way to explain it. Whoever was behind all of this knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, and even what I was wearing. The drive home felt longer than usual, every turn and every stoplight making me more paranoid. I didn't know who was behind the messages, but I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be the last time I heard from them. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. It was like I was trapped in a game, and I didn't know the rules. Story 22. I was getting ready for the day, going through my usual routine, when the sudden vibration of my smartwatch broke the silence. I glanced at the screen, expecting a notification about the weather or a text from a friend, but instead it displayed a reminder for the meeting. I stared at the words, confused. I hadn't scheduled any meetings, nor could I remember making plans for anything that day. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to recall if I had somehow forgotten about an appointment or a call. My calendar showed nothing, and there were no messages in my inbox about any upcoming meetings. I tapped the screen, but the reminder didn't go away. It just sat there, staring back at me as if it was mocking my confusion. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. Maybe it was a glitch, I thought. I decided to dismiss the reminder and go about my day, but as soon as I pressed the button, the vibration returned. My smartwatch buzzed again, this time even more urgently, and the reminder for the meeting flashed back on the screen. I checked the settings, searching for any possible cause for this repetitive reminder, but everything seemed normal. The calendar was clear, and no apps had been synced to add a new event. My mind raced. What was going on? I'd never experienced anything like this before. It wasn't just the reminder that unsettled me, it was the fact that it had no origin, no source. It didn't feel like a mistake. I decided to ignore it, trying to move forward with my day. As I sat down to work, I couldn't stop glancing at my smartwatch. Every few minutes, the same reminder popped up, as though it was attached to me. The message felt more like an intrusion with each passing moment. The weirdest part was that the reminder didn't specify which meeting it was talking about. No details, no time, no location. It was as if I was expected to already know about it, but I didn't. I wasn't even sure what it meant. There was nothing that should have triggered it. By mid-afternoon, I had become distracted and restless. I decided to leave the house and clear my head, hoping the fresh air would help. As soon as I stepped outside, the reminder disappeared from the smartwatch screen, and I almost breathed a sigh of relief. But then, as I walked down the street, I noticed something strange. I saw a figure standing at the end of the block, just out of the corner of my eye. They were standing still, facing away from me. I couldn't make out any details, but something about the figure felt wrong. The way they were standing, almost as if they were waiting for something. I quickly turned away, trying to dismiss the thought. I was overthinking, I told myself. The reminder had just been a malfunction, and the figure I saw was probably just someone minding their business. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I returned home, the reminder was gone from my smartwatch, but I couldn't let it go. I tried to go about my evening, but my mind kept going back to the figure I saw. Was it related to the reminder? Had someone been waiting for me? That night I went to bed exhausted, hoping I could finally get some sleep without any further disturbances. But as soon as I closed my eyes, my smartwatch buzzed again. This time the reminder for the meeting was back, but with a new message attached. It read, "It's time." I shot out of bed, my heart racing. The room felt suffocating as I glanced at the smartwatch in disbelief. My hands trembled as I tried to unlock the screen, but the message wouldn't go away. My mind raced. What did it mean? What was happening? It was almost as if the watch was forcing me into something, but I had no idea what. I stood frozen for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told me to turn off the smartwatch, to ignore the reminder and go back to sleep, but something was stopping me. The message, the figure outside, it all felt too connected, too deliberate. I pulled myself together and grabbed my phone, checking for any missed messages or calls. Still, there was nothing. I scrolled through my contacts, wondering if someone had been trying to reach me, but no one had. The only clue was the persistent reminder on my smartwatch, taunting me with its vague message. My mind was racing now, trying to put the pieces together. Could someone be messing with me? Maybe someone had hacked my smartwatch, sending these cryptic reminders to unsettle me. Or maybe it was all in my head, a result of stress and sleepless nights. Just when I thought I was starting to lose control, the reminder vanished from the smartwatch screen. The sudden emptiness left me feeling even more uneasy. What did that mean? Why had it disappeared? I sat there in the silence, unsure of what to do next. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The feeling that something was going on, something beyond just a malfunction, was too strong. I had to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. But as I got up to investigate, my smartwatch buzzed once more. This time the message was different. It read, "I'm waiting." I froze, staring at the screen. That was the final straw. I had to find out who was behind this. I couldn't let this continue, but I had no idea where to start. I rushed to check the security cameras around my house, hoping they might give me some answers. But when I pulled up the footage, I found nothing. The camera showed no one near my door, no strange activity. Everything appeared normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone knew more about me than they should. The reminder on my smartwatch was more than just a glitch, it was something else. Something that was slowly driving me to the edge. Story 23. It was early in the morning when I noticed it. I had just gotten up and was making my way downstairs, groggy from sleep, my mind still hazy. The house was quiet, the usual creaks and groans of the old building still present in the silence. As I approached the front door to check the mail, I saw it. A deep, jagged scratch on the lock, as though someone had scraped it with something sharp, trying to force their way in. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the lock. The scratch was fresh, the metal still slightly marred, but there were no signs of damage around the doorframe or the door itself. No broken glass, no disheveled locks, nothing that would suggest an actual attempt to break in. It was just that one mark, a sharp and deliberate scratch right across the center of the lock. I slowly ran my fingers over it, feeling the rough edges where the metal had been gouged. Whoever had done this hadn't succeeded. They hadn't gotten in. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I heard anything last night? Any noises outside? But no. The night had been silent. I couldn't recall hearing anything that would suggest someone had been lurking around my door. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just some random vandal, someone who had a grudge or was messing around. But even as I thought it, I knew deep down it wasn't that simple. The lock had been targeted. Whoever had scratched it had known exactly what they were doing. I glanced around, checking for any other signs of disturbance, but everything seemed perfectly normal. The porch was clear, the yard undisturbed. No broken windows, no signs of someone sneaking around the property. It was almost like the scratch had appeared out of nowhere, as if it had been placed there with a purpose, yet no one had even been close to the door. I shook my head, trying to push the unsettling thought out of my mind, but it lingered. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of more, the fact that someone had tried to break in, or the fact that they hadn't succeeded, leaving me no clue as to who they were or what their intentions had been. I decided to call the police, just to report the incident. Maybe they could check for fingerprints or see if anyone in the area had experienced something similar. It felt like overkill, but something told me I couldn't ignore it. I didn't know what had been going on, but I had a feeling that this was just the beginning. As I spoke to the officer on the phone, I kept looking at the lock. I didn't want to let myself think about the fact that the door had been targeted, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how vulnerable I felt. The idea of someone trying to break in, someone who knew exactly where I lived, where to scratch, where to try to force their way in, it made my skin crawl. The officer told me they would send someone to check it out, but that I should be cautious and make sure the house was locked and secure. I nodded, even though I didn't feel reassured. I didn't feel safe. It wasn't just the lock anymore, it was the fact that someone had been close, that they had been watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been waiting for the right moment, trying to find an opening. I knew it was irrational, but I found myself checking every door, every window, making sure they were secure. I even went so far as to set up a few security cameras around the house, hoping it would make me feel more secure, though deep down, I wasn't sure it would. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes before my thoughts drifted back to the scratch on the lock. What if they came back? What if they were still watching? It felt like there was a presence, something lurking just outside of my awareness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept looking over my shoulder, jumping at the smallest noises. I wasn't used to feeling this way. I had always thought of my home as a safe place, a sanctuary. But now it felt like a cage, and I was trapped inside it, unable to escape the feeling that someone was out there, waiting. By the time the officer arrived, I was already a mess. I showed them the lock, explained what had happened, and pointed out the lack of any other signs of a break-in. The officer inspected the lock closely, running their fingers over the scratch, nodding as though they were deep in thought. They asked me a few questions, but their answers didn't make me feel any better. No one in the neighborhood had reported anything unusual. There were no cameras around to capture anything, and no one had seen anything suspicious. It was as though whoever had done it had vanished without a trace. The officer gave me a few tips on staying vigilant, reminding me to lock all doors and windows and to make sure the house was secure. They left, assuring me they would follow up, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. Every time I looked at the door, every time I thought about the scratch, the dread would rise up again. I knew it wasn't over. I knew that whoever had done this wouldn't just walk away. The next few days were a blur. I kept checking the lock, obsessively unable to stop myself. The scratch never faded, and neither did my anxiety. I kept looking over my shoulder, kept feeling like I was being watched. I started noticing things that I hadn't before, small details that seemed out of place. A broken branch on a tree across the street. A car that seemed to be parked a little too long in front of my house. But when I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't. There was no evidence, no concrete proof. It was all just paranoia, or so I told myself. It wasn't until a week later that I noticed something different. The scratch on the lock was gone, just like that. It wasn't visible anymore. I ran my fingers over the metal, feeling for any remnants of the gouge, but it was smooth. Completely smooth. I stood there for a long time, wondering what it meant. Had someone come back and fixed it? Had they been watching me, waiting for the right moment to finish what they had started? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I don't know what to believe anymore. The feeling of being watched has never left. Even though the scratch is gone, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, still waiting, still watching. I lock the door every night, but somehow it doesn't feel like enough. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Story 24. I had just left the cafe, enjoying the quiet of the evening as I walked down the empty street. The air was crisp, and the dim streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalk. It was late, the kind of hour when the world seems to be sleeping, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My mind wandered as I walked, lost in thought, until my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. It read, "Look behind you." A chill ran down my spine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. The street was deserted. No one was around. There was only the eerie silence that seemed to stretch forever. My eyes scanned the empty sidewalk, but there was nothing there, no one in sight. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease that was quickly creeping in. It was probably just a prank, right? But something about it felt off, too real to be brushed aside. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at my phone screen, as if waiting for some kind of confirmation, some rational explanation. But there was nothing. My thumb hovered over the screen, and for a second, I considered responding, asking who this was. But before I could type anything, another text came through. "Why aren't you looking?" My stomach turned. I hadn't heard anyone approach, but the message was clear. Someone knew I wasn't looking behind me. I turned around slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The street was still empty. No figures in the distance. No one walking toward me. Just the same empty stretch of sidewalk that had been there when I first looked. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart began to race. I felt as though something was lurking just beyond my sight, but every time I turned around, the street remained vacant. I quickly looked at my phone again, my hands trembling now. There was no name attached to the number. No way of knowing who had sent the texts or where they were coming from. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, the kind of fear that tightens your chest and leaves you unable to think clearly. Keep walking. I glanced around, my eyes darting between the dark buildings lining the street. I was the only person in sight. My footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound accompanying me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I could feel something in the air, something heavy and oppressive. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was being drawn into something, like I was walking deeper into an unknown, creeping danger. Another text came through. "I'm right behind you." I turned around so quickly I almost stumbled, but the street was still empty. The same quiet stretch of pavement. No one was there. No footsteps behind me. The only thing behind me was the darkness, stretching for blocks in either direction. I stood there for a moment, breathless, as my phone buzzed again. "Noticing anything yet?" The question sent a wave of panic through me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could they know what I was doing? How could they possibly know I wasn't looking behind me? I looked down the street, feeling my pulse quicken. The emptiness of the street felt suffocating now, like it was closing in around me. I checked my surroundings one last time before I started walking again, faster this time. Each step felt heavier, like the ground beneath me was shifting. The streetlights ahead of me flickered as I moved, casting strange, wavering shadows across the sidewalk. The street was still empty, but it no longer felt empty. I was being watched. I could feel it. My phone buzzed again. "Don't run." My feet stopped moving on their own. I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep walking or if I was afraid to move at all. The text had been too direct, too precise. It was like the sender knew exactly what I was about to do. Every move I made seemed to be predicted before I made it. I didn't know how that was possible. I didn't know how they knew what I was thinking, where I was going, or what I was about to do next. I glanced over my shoulder again. The street was still empty, but the sense of being followed had never been more overwhelming. I wasn't alone anymore. Even though there was no one in sight, I felt the presence of someone close behind me, breathing down my neck. The kind of presence that doesn't just linger at watches. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short gasps as my heart pounded in my chest. I had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to get away from the invisible watcher. I looked over my shoulder again, expecting to see someone gaining on me, but there was still no one there. Yet the feeling of being chased never left. I could feel eyes on me, always just out of sight, always just behind me. I ran faster. Another text came through, just as I rounded a corner. "You can't escape me." I stopped, chest heaving with exertion, and checked my phone. The street was still empty. I was still alone. But the message echoed in my mind. It was like a cruel game, one where the rules were unknown, and I was trapped in a maze with no way out. I tried to think rationally, to tell myself that it was just a prank, some twisted joke from a stranger, but the feeling of being hunted wouldn't let me go. I looked up and saw a light in the distance, a street lamp casting a pool of warmth in the cold air. It was too far to reach, but it was my only direction, my only hope of finding some kind of safety. My legs moved instinctively toward it, the fear driving me forward despite my exhaustion. When I reached the light, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against the pole. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see any more messages. I just wanted the silence, the relief of being away from whatever was following me. But I couldn't escape the feeling. Even though I was standing in the light, the presence was still there, lurking in the shadows just beyond the reach of the street lamp. I turned the phone over in my hands, staring at the screen. There were no new messages, no texts that gave me any clues. Just the silence of the night and the distant hum of the city. I wasn't sure if I was still being watched, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay out here alone anymore. I couldn't trust that I was truly safe. As I walked home, I kept my eyes wide open, constantly checking my surroundings. The text had stopped coming, but the feeling of being watched had not gone away. It stayed with me, the shadow that would never leave, no matter how fast I ran. And when I reached the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't over, that whoever was watching me was still out there, waiting. Story 25. It was a routine I never really thought about, just something I did without thinking. Every week, I'd take the trash out the night before pickup, and by the time the truck rolled around the